So the defense ministers of NATO countries are convening in Brussels for what may be the last meeting before the NATO summit taking place in Washington, D.C. Now, a lot of topics were discussed, and joining us, we have guests to talk more about these issues.
That's right. So now joining us to discuss these very issues, what does it mean for Ukraine defenses, is Joshua Burgin from the Warsaw Security Forum. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning, Ben and Oleksandr. Thanks for having me.
So, if you could help us unpack now the situation here, and what were the main topics discussed during the first day of defense minister meetings in Brussels?
Well, clearly this is the last meeting, as already cited, the last meeting ahead of the summit in Washington. As you can imagine, on the international stage for the summit in D.C., the goal is to solve all the problems ahead of time. So, for instance, there's been serious discussions about the level of continued NATO funding. The level of manufacturing support coming out of Europe, as well as the United States. I'm certain there's been other sidebar conversations beyond simply the question of Ukraine, not to mention who will lead NATO following October when Jens Stoltenberg steps aside. And also noteworthy in the news in the past few days is the Russian flotilla that's floated towards Havana with expectations of even more, with military exercises taking place in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean over the summer.
Right, a lot of the discussion in this specific summit is about the stable and predictable aid to Ukraine. A lot of conversation revolving around the current support structure for NATO to Ukraine is sort of ad hoc without a very specific plan, and that may mostly have to do with NATO not being able to provide Ukraine aid as a bloc but as individual countries. Do you think that now with more coordination being discussed, this line is kind of being blurred, or do you think, well, this distinction probably shouldn't have been in the first place?
I don't know that I would say that. I mean, Jens Stoltenberg said clearly yesterday that year over year, the support has been about $40 billion for military aid. And they expected that level of support would not only take place going forward, but would be committed to formally. How that plays out, of course, remains to be seen. As you've pointed out, there is some sort of ad hoc sort of one country gives, another country gives. But I suspect that there is at least some tacit agreements on that front based on his statements.
And do we know now any specifics on the long-term strategies that were discussed to ensure sustainable support for Ukraine? Of course, we are talking about now the training for the soldiers, but are there any new developments, perhaps?
Well, I mean, let's be serious. If there are long-term strategies, the political uncertainty that exists across Europe right now brings all, I mean, even if there was sort of a concrete plan, how much is that dependable, say, if, for instance, France sees a significant leadership change by the end of the month? How does that change depending on the presidential elections in the United States? I think there's a lot of notional agreements, many of which will probably hold over time, but there are some political factors well beyond the boundaries of the NATO halls themselves, the partner countries, that leave anything that's sort of discussed as at best an ideal. I'm not concerned about it. I'm not suggesting we should deeply worry, but always the political factors, and so many elections taking place this particular calendar year, always leave some sort of question marks in terms of the solid nature of those agreements, whatever they may emerge to be.
Right, and whenever the NATO summit is taking place for the past few years, of course, Ukraine is also always kind of waiting with bated breath on their membership to NATO. How much do you think we have progressed since the last NATO summit? And do you think that there will be any significant announcements?
Well, there's a couple things I've observed. Even just watching the live coverage ahead of this conversation, Zelensky's English language proficiency has increased dramatically since the war began. On top of that, they have stepped up their lobbying efforts. We've seen this in Brussels. We've seen this in D.C. And when I say they've stepped it up, I think Ukraine has consistently been there, but the level of professionalism, the degree to which their constituents are effectively communicating to members. I mean, we've seen a higher level of persuasion over past years, as both I think the capacity of Ukraine has increased, but the urgency around the question, that everyone understands that should Ukraine fail to protect its borders, that the rest of Europe comes under greater threat in the future from Russia. So to that end, I think the two things happening at once have really advanced Ukraine. I personally would like to see, in addition to the aggressive lobbying, I would love to see some sidebar activities on the part of Ukraine with thank you tours around both the United States and Europe. There's significant diaspora in both countries. I think that would help them even further to expand their lobbying efforts beyond simply the direct ask, but also recognition that countries and individual constituencies, communities within these countries are contributing significantly to their defense and their future.
And now, following your thought, I wonder how important is really the unity among the NATO allies providing consistent support to Ukraine, considering now recent statements by Viktor Orban that Hungary should be excluded from the measures supporting Ukraine? What do you think?
Well, to your broad point about unity, I mean, before the war in Ukraine, there was all sorts of conversations about the EU and the United States experiencing a rift. Great questions around NATO. Much of that is solved, as there is a great deal of unanimity around what the course of action should be. There's a great deal of cost. Investments have been made. The notion that Orban is going to disrupt that, I mean, we understand he's a bit of a problem child within the overall NATO community. Nevertheless, they're part of the overall EU family, and I understand that the back channels, at least, are doing whatever possible to both accommodate while not so much so as to encourage others to do the same. It's a tricky situation because if you push him out of the fold, he has nowhere but bad places to go. If for whatever the reason, politically, internally, or even just his own worldview constrains him, I believe that the NATO leadership has been very intentional about making sure to be inclusive without pushing him even further into the arms of would-be adversaries.
All right, and when we talk about this particular NATO meeting, as well as the G7 meeting that's taking place, a key word that has emerged is the term training. It has been repeated a lot when it comes to the newly conscripted Ukrainian soldiers. Do you think that only has to do with the logistics on the ground, or maybe we're looking at the potential of helping Ukraine kind of integrate with the way that NATO operates, maybe for an easier integration going forward?
Well, I think speaking of NATO integration on behalf of Ukraine is a bit premature. Nevertheless, concepts, tools, skill sets. I mean, we've seen in recent weeks and months that Ukraine is also sort of pressing forward and taking on operations in Africa. This would have been unthinkable in the beginning of the conflict. It's intentional, obviously, that they're taking conflict to Russia as it's attempting to collect gold and resources out of the continent. Nevertheless, the notion that it's going to sort of exist in its own sort of isolated bucket without training, without engagement, I mean, clearly pulling soldiers out of the field so they can experience training, and or perhaps advisors on the ground providing training. This is not new. I mean, the U.S. National Guard and other state-level forces have been in Ukraine for decades. I can't imagine this is a new thing, even if it is sort of newly being recovered in the media space.
Joshua Burgin from Warsaw Security Forum was our guest today. Thank you so much for providing your insights.
As always, thanks for having me. Have a good day.